All right, today we're going to have a very interesting conversation because we've decided to make this a devil's advocate episode. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to ask the question, has the U.S. constitutional system failed? Because more and more people are starting to ask the question, well, if the Constitution worked, then why hasn't it? Why hasn't it saved us from everything that we see going on in the country right now? While still others certainly believe that classical liberalism, the underlying philosophy of the Constitution, is absolutely as relevant today as it was then. It just needs to be properly defended. And so today we're going to ask those questions. We're going to talk about the U.S. constitutional system briefly because most of us already kind of know what that looks like. But then we're also going to talk about what they commonly refer to as post-liberalism or neo-reactionaryism. And these guys are offering some different solutions with how we tackle the problems today and what sort of government we might want to embrace going forward. So we're going to have a robust conversation where different members of the podcast are going to take different sides in this debate and hash it all out for you. All of that and more coming up on this episode of Making the Argument. As always, I am your host, Nick Freitas. With me in the studio, my beautiful bride, Tina, Queen of the Bees.
Hello, everyone.
And then we have our political prognosticator and resident historian, Christian Hines.
I get to be the villain today.
Well, we'll see. Maybe the villain, maybe not the villain. We're just not really sure. So let's lay out some kind of like ground rules so everyone in the audience watching understands kind of what we're going to do today. Christian is going to play the black-pilled, post-liberal, neo-reactionary. So himself. That's a little bit harsh. I'm going to play the white-pilled guy that like fully still believes in this constitutional system that we have, as well as concepts behind classical liberalism.
So basically yourself.
So basically myself. Tina, on the other hand, is going to play the open-minded person that is going to carefully listen to both of our arguments and then probably explain why both of us are wrong and why she should just be dictator for life.
So basically myself.
We all get to play ourselves today. It'll be such an organic podcast. Nobody has to fake anything.
But the reason why this is important is because this question has come up. We recently did an interview with James Lindsay, which is going to be coming up here shortly, and he's addressed some of the problems with this. We've talked a little bit about the concept of what the neo-reactionaries want. And the most important thing to remember is that the various sides in this debate have good points to be made. The question is what path do we want to go as a country and why? And do we have any confidence that the path that we do go can actually get us to a point where, once again, we feel like we're living in a free country where people have the right to self-determination, right? That's the goal. And so we're going to have this as an honest conversation because there are a lot of people that think that our own government has let us down. I would think everybody at this table actually believes that. The question is where should the blame be properly assigned, right? And would it be possible to actually get to a system where, if anything else, we've at least heavily mitigated the chance that we will be let down? One of the things that we can't stand is somebody that advertises one way, right? And then does something completely different. But you know who you don't have to worry about with that? Jeremy's Razors, right? When Jeremy's Razors tells you they're going to give you a quality product, they give you a quality product. And I'm going to talk specifically about they have now, it's the Precision 5 flip back trimmer, lets you perfect those sharp lines. Why is that important? Well, because if you're a guy like me, if you're a guy like Christian that has a beard, a very prominent masculine beard, you need to be able to trim around that thing, right? Just because we don't shave all of the face doesn't mean we don't shave any of the face. And Jeremy has you covered, right? Jeremy's has you covered with all of the accoutrement you need to both keep a clean-shaven face, if that's what your lady prefers, or to make sure that that luxurious beard that you have crafted, that you have properly manicured in order to be the very pinnacle of masculinity, stays right where it needs to be. That's where you can get things like beard oils, you can get the brushes, you can get everything that you need. Plus, as a guy that doesn't particularly like to shop and really doesn't like to make separate shopping trips for all of the razors and combs and beard oils and shampoo and all that, I like the fact that I can go to Jeremy's Razors, right? I can go to jeremy'srazors.com. I can use promo code Nick, and I can get 15% off my order, and it's just going to come to my door. So if you go to the link in the description, and use promo code Nick. You're going to get 15% off your entire order. So what I would recommend is take Jeremy's to the cleaner, man. Go there, buy all that stuff, right? Get it delivered to your door, get 15% off, and be happy because once again, Jeremy's Razors, the only razors made exclusively of roundhouse kicks from Chuck Norris. Because that's the only type of razor that can handle this facial hair, right? Only type. Jeremy'sRazors.com. Go to the link in the description. Use promo code Nick. Get 50% off. All right. First thing that we're going to lay out just for kind of the purpose of defining the terms is what do we mean when we talk about the U.S. constitutional system or the classical liberal position, all right? So the U.S. constitutional system, very simple. You can look at the United States Constitution. You can look at the philosophy behind it. So when we talk about the classical liberal side, right, a lot of that you see kind of mentioned in the Declaration of Independence, right? Most famous portion, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Interestingly enough, in the first draft of that, it was life, liberty, and property, right? And that was kind of a takeaway from John Locke's two treatises on government. You really should, when you look at classical liberalism, John Locke has a lot to do with kind of articulating all of that in a way that the founders used a great deal in formulating the various concepts they wanted. Because you need to understand the founders didn't start off with what sort of government do we want. They started off with what sort of country, what sort of society do we want to be, right? There was an underlying philosophical question to that. And they decided that they wanted a system which maximized individual liberty, property rights, and things of that nature. Now, again, everyone will come back later and say, well, what about slavery? What about I get it, but keep in mind at that time, the concepts, the philosophies that they were laying out and then enshrining into a government system were truly revolutionary. And I would argue, as Frederick Douglass argues, and as other people have argued, that it actually sowed the seeds for the destruction of things like slavery, and like Jim Crow and things like that, because again, it was antithetical to the underlying philosophical position. So when you think of classical liberalism, you're essentially thinking of a system which believes in the inherent sovereignty of the individual, which is to say that you have ownership of your own body, that you should have the right to own property, that you should be able to have the right to self-determination. And insofar as you're going to have a government system, there should be limits on it where it recognizes its role to protect your rights and protect your freedoms and otherwise provide a system which provides for safety, whether it be from foreign invasion or providing for domestic tranquility, as our Constitution states. That's kind of the classical liberal model. And then our U.S. constitutional system is rooted in a couple of ideas. One was the concept of federalism. So you have a federal government with certain powers. Those powers are supposed to be specific and enumerated. You can find those in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. Sets up our three branches of government. It's all rooted on this idea of the separation of powers in order to prevent tyranny. Then you look at things like the Bill of Rights, which again, the important part about the Bill of Rights is it's not the government stating, here's the rights you have. It's the government acknowledging that you already have these rights and that they have some obligation to protect them or to provide for the security of said rights. And so when you look at our U.S. constitutional system, federalism, separation of powers, representation, all of these are core concepts of our U.S. constitutional system. So when I talk about this, when I use words like classical liberalism, it's rooted in the philosophical side of it. When I talk about the constitutional system, that's rooted in kind of the practical application of that and what we currently have in the United States. So that's what I'm talking about. And here to talk about the neo-reactionary position, right, is Christian. So Christian, go for it.
Yay. Okay, so I just want to point out before we begin that I used to hold all of the positions that you just outlined.
Yeah.
And even though we're making the argument, no pun intended today, back and forth, we're actually having a debate. This might be the first time ever that you and I are sitting at this table and we're going to disagree with each other, which is kind of interesting because, I view you as like one of my best friends. And I think that we share quite a lot of values. I think that 90+% of the issues we're in alignment with. But
well, I think what's so interesting about this conversation is you and I do share like the core fundamental values. This is more a conversation of what is the best way forward to protect those values, and that's where we disagree.
Yes,
or have some disagreement.
We're both adherents to the Austrian school.
Mm-hmm.
We both understand the business cycle. We're both ardent free market supporters. We're both Christians. We both have those same philosophical moral worldviews, right? we're both fans of intentional communities, all these type of things. That's why we became friends. That's why you have me on your podcast.
And that's why both of us at one point would have, even if we weren't big L libertarians, we both found libertarian philosophy very, very intriguing.
Yes. And I was telling Tino right before we started rolling the cameras that, there was a point in time where I would have argued, and I think I would have been correct in arguing this, that I was more libertarian than Nick.
Yes.
I think Nick is now more libertarian than me, because I am not a libertarian. And so to outline the position that I'll be approaching from.
Christian is now a MAGA Republican,
I
neo-reactionary.
I wouldn't even call myself a MAGA Republican, because I
I'm
think that's still
kidding.
to the
That was
left.
a joke. But before you get too far into like fighting back and forth on anything, are you going to give a definition of what a neo-reactionary
Yes.
is?
I tweeted something the other day. I don't have it pulled up, but I tweeted something the other day, and I said something along the lines of, call me a reactionary. I've seen what you call progress. And I think there's some truth to that. There's another tweet that I put out that I think really encapsulates this. This prominent account managing editor for the Babylon Bee actually asked a question. And he called it the dissident right. There's many different terms to describe this phenomenon. Some people call it post-liberalism. Some people call it neo-reactionaryism. Some people call it the dissident right, rather than the alt-right or the classical right or the libertarian right. It means the same thing, though. Neo-reactionaryism, post-liberalism, dissident right, it all basically means the same thing. And he asked this question where he was like, he wanted to understand what this worldview is. He was quoting a guy that I actually appreciate a lot of his takes, Aaron McIntyre, and he was asking this question, and he said, I'm only asking questions to try to understand it. And I tried to give a short explanation of what this is, and I think this encapsulates the position that I'm going to be arguing today. I said, everyone has different definitions of the DR. I was referring to it as the dissident right, but you can call it neo-reactionaryism, you can call it post-liberalism. Everybody has different definitions of the dissident right, but the premise is rather straightforward. Liberalism does not work. More broadly, it's a belief that liberalism functions as a sort of universal solvent, dissolving all of the bonds, both culturally and politically, that enable society to function. I would not call this normie boomer conservatism, because normie boomer conservatism is itself predicated on liberalism. And I was quoting Joel Berry here when he was the one who used that phrase. And he was saying, this to me seems like it's just a rehashing of what he called normie boomer conservatism. And I was trying to point out, no, the neo-reactionary, post-liberal, dissident right approach, which is very unpopular on the right because it challenges many of the inherent notions that the right in America runs with. Many of the classical liberal constitutionalist
articulate some of that.
Explain why liberalism does not work.
So and again, we're talking about classical liberalism, not like left-wing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So
because I'm just saying for now, like you're already losing points because you haven't given a good definition for what a neo-reactionary is. And Nick gave this beautiful, eloquent explanation.
So I'm already losing
for what a classical liberal position is.
Okay.
So you're going to need to try to like
Speed
up your
it
game
up,
just
Hoss.
a little bit here.
The best encapsulation that I can give is it is the unpopular, at least in America, position that classical liberalism does not work. That liberalism is actually what I called a universal solvent. It is something that ends up dissolving the bonds that hold society together. Society cannot function, and we've actually talked at length about this with our concept of intentional communities. And you and I have had many conversations on and off camera, many off camera as well, about how there needs to be a unifying set of underlying goals, philosophy, purpose, moral vision, worldview in order for society to function. It's the whole, there was a dream that was Rome.
So would it be fair to say, like if we're going to distinguish between that, your problem with classical liberalism is not private property rights, right? Like
no,
that's
not
not the problem at all. The problem is that classical liberalism, because of its emphasis on kind of like maybe we'll word it this way, an overly secularized belief in this idea of just self-determination and limited government or representative government. Maybe that's a better way to put it. Democracy, right? That's the problem, is that when the core foundation of your worldview is, as long as we can all vote and own property, we'll all be fine.
Yes, you're getting much closer to what I'm trying to get across. I am not arguing against property rights. When I'm critiquing classical liberalism, I'm not arguing against property rights. I'm not arguing against free markets. I'm not arguing against the Austrian school. I believe in all of those things. Mm-hmm. That's why I'm not a leftist.
So it's the approach that you disagree with.
What I disagree with, and this, understand, this has been an existential crisis for myself personally over the last 4 years, because 4 years ago, I voted for the libertarian candidate for president 4 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Oh my gosh.
And I mean, and
Johnson?
Joe Jorgensen.
Jorgensen.
No, I've never voted for.
That was the one before.
Yeah.
That's
but right. What is Aleppo? But so like, I'm not critiquing property rights. Again, I'm not critiquing free markets. What I'm critiquing is this belief that you can set up neutral structures, neutral institutions, you can set up democracy, and that this will depoliticize things, and that this overemphasis almost like medieval nominalist view, materialist, secularist view, that you can set up a society that's just neutral on these things, and everybody will just be free to, it's you live you, right? You be you, just go chase your dream, just pursue your own happiness. Well, what if my happiness involves constructing a society that is the antithesis to everything you believe in, and then I impose it on you because I don't share the same moral vision as you? That's the problem that we're in right now. And the dissonant right approach, the neo-reactionary approach, the post-liberal approach, now some of these people that fall within these categories might critique free markets. Yeah. That's a problem, and it's a problem that I've recognized. I am not one of those people. Yeah. I'm still firmly rooted in a free market, Austrian school property rights approach. But I now have come to the realization, and it's been an existential realization, but I've come to a realization that the political system, the philosophical approach that I used to believe in, because I know all this theory, I know libertarian theory, I don't think it works. I think it is what I said earlier. It is a universal solvent that dissolves the unifying bonds that enable a society, a culture, a civilization, a nation to function. There has to be a shared worldview. There has to be an intentional community. If you don't have that, you end up getting what we have right now, which is chaos and anarchy.
Can I ask you a question about that? Do you think that part of the reason for it not working is because it fundamentally does not work with government, period? Because government exists to bend people to their will in some way, shape, or form. Like, there is no need for government if there was no need to make people comply to something, even if it's the right thing, right? Mm-hmm. So we're making murderers comply with the idea that murder's wrong, right? Things like that. If classical liberalism worked, the need for government wouldn't exist.
Is that kind of a central theme of the argument?
I wrote something in our circle group that ended up getting like almost 150 comments. It sparked a huge debate. In fact, it was such a big debate that it ended up turning into a 4-hour not live stream, but 4-hour discussion between Andrew and I.
think it's hilarious.
Well, but are we?
You're like the guy that's always quoting his own book over here.
I want to point out the arguments that I'm espousing are not from me. I'm not a genius.
Well, let me
Other
ask you
people
this.
have identified these problems.
Let me ask you this, because we're going to talk about the problem, right? And we're going to talk about the whole problem. Well, if the Constitution worked, why hasn't it worked, right? Like, why are we in this place where the federal government has grown, far beyond what was ever intended? Why are they doing things that the founders never would have dreamed of? Isn't this evidence that this wonderful constitutional system has actually failed us, right? Like, that's the problem. And I think you're about to go into that here.
Yeah.
So just so everyone's on the same sheet of music, right? If you look at like libertarianism, like hardcore libertarianism and the non-aggression principle, the idea behind it is essentially that, all government is force. That is true at a very fundamental level. And so therefore, and any use of force to get what you want, right, even if you think it's good, there's something fundamentally immoral and wrong about that. That's kind of the non-aggression principle. Now, most libertarians accept that there's going to be some level of government, and so they might call themselves minarchists, right, which is like the minimum amount of government absolutely necessary to keep society together. Then you have other people that would be, what they call anarchists, which is to say that there shouldn't be any government because it's all force and force is wrong. From a practical level, what classical liberalism and libertarian philosophy, and not to say that they're the exact same thing, but close, right? what is it sought to do is minimize government. And one of the things that it's also sought to do is to create a government that doesn't constantly interfere on decisions which, the classical liberals say, well, that's a personal decision or maybe a family decision. It is not a government decision. So a good example of this would be something like drugs, right? A more classically liberal position might say that, well, if you're not hurting anyone, that's fine for you to take, and the government shouldn't try to expend time and resources. For moral reasons, the government shouldn't do it because now you're trying to impose yourself on an individual decision, right? I would guess that a neo-reactionary position would say, well, no, that doesn't make any sense because drugs have all kinds of horrible effects, and regardless, and you're never going to be able to create a situation where the drugs don't result in people using force or people doing other things, right? The classical liberal would respond, oh, but when you use force to try to stop it, all you do is create a black market. Neo-reactionary might respond with, which means you got to shoot them harder. Like it's, and I'm not trying to be flippant or trying to straw man the neo-reactionary argument, but what I've always gotten from the neo-reactionaries is if you really want to protect certain fundamental principles about a society, we are not just economic beings. And one of the common critiques of libertarian is you treat everyone like they're economic beings and we're all just hedonists. When in reality, there's actually so much more. Right now, again, the classical liberal responds with, well, no, we're just saying you should be, yes, the hardcore libertarian says, yes, this person should be free to do drugs and you should be free to do missionary work, right? So we acknowledge that you have good impulses and bad impulses. We just don't think the government should be the one predominantly adjudicating between those impulses.
Until they want them to. Wait.
I don't want to totally get off on.
There is a parameter where they do think force is okay.
Okay, but most of it...
Or force is even right.
Okay, but when they say that, and this is the part where we need to do an honest critique, right? An honest libertarian is going to say, I didn't say no force was necessary. I said aggressive force is a problem. If you're going to use force to defend yourself or to defend an innocent person, we got no problem with that. The problem is all government force is by definition aggressive force. Now, and that's because they tax you, they set up rules. And the libertarian doesn't have a problem with a rule that says you can't steal from somebody. The libertarian, like the hardcore libertarian or the hardcore, anarcho-capitalist, has a problem with the government saying, I'm going to take your money to set up police and a court system. So if somebody does steal from somebody, now we have an apparatus to go and attack it or go and deal with it. Okay. But again, that's all like the neo-reactionary. And I don't want to keep doing your part of this, but I feel like the neo-reactionary looks at that and says, okay, but how's that worked out for you? How's that worked out for you in a society where now you've got, homeless encampments all over California and you've got, intravenous drug users all over the street, and you've got people that are harder on the taxpayer that is forced to deal with this than they are with the people actually committing the crimes.
So let me ask this question. I think this will help us get to the root of this, because so far Christian has very much explained how he's not really at his core neo-reactionary. Tell us, in what areas have you found yourself agreeing with the neo-reactionary response? Name off a few scenarios where the liberal would do this, but you think it needs to be this.
That's a good question.
Democracy is one of the biggest ones. I've criticized that repeatedly on this show, on Twitter, and person with other people.
So you, by definition, are a threat to democracy.
When leftists say Donald Trump is a threat to democracy, I will respond with, oh, I wish he was.
Oh my God.
Because
and keep in mind, because there's going to be a lot of people watching this go, oh, well, he just means like the version of democracy, which is mob rule and majority rules, and no matter what they want. He doesn't mean representative government. And I think
to a point, it's
the neo-reactionary position says no, representative government is also part of the problem.
No, not quite. Some might, right? Yeah. Some might say absolute, monarchy. But there's plenty of people that you could call, thinkers within this mold. They go back centuries, by the way, right? Because the name implies neo-reactionaryism, right? It implies that, well, they're drawing upon actual reactionaries, people that opposed the French Revolution, for example. believe it or not, I would put somebody like Edmund Burke into this category as well, who was a liberal until the French Revolution took place, and then he became a conservative, and he's considered the father of modern day conservatism. So I think there's a broad category here, but the biggest issue that I have with liberalism is that it is universalizing in the sense that, almost like the new Soviet man, it's this belief that we can remake mankind in a liberal image because mankind is Homo economicus. No, mankind is not Homo economicus. Humans are not interchangeable parts. You cannot pluck somebody from Japan and plop them in Germany and they will become Germans. There's a culture and a history and traditions that make those two places separate. And that leads to a bunch of implications about, open borders and trade and economics, but it also leads to some philosophical differences, because what you're saying is that liberalism puts forward this idea that, well, actually, ultimately, they're all the same. Mm-hmm. And as a Christian, you can believe, well, they're certainly all the same morally. Mm-hmm. Every human has the same moral worth. But that does not mean that liberalism can actually replace some of these things that are, I think, necessary to give people meaning and purpose in being in existence, and gets them out of bed in the morning. Here's a good example. Liberalism proposes that we can construct political institutions and processes that are inherently neutral. I have this big thread here that I haven't actually posted because it's still being worked on. But and so, like, if you're seeing this, understand this is not going to be a final thing. But one of the biggest problems that I have with liberalism is that it prioritizes process over outcomes, right? And so it's okay, we've created all these mechanisms. Democracy is a primary vehicle of this, right? We've created all these political mechanisms through voting, through elections, through the three branches of government. We have our Constitution, and these are supposed to be neutral. They're supposed to be morally neutral. They're not supposed to pick a side. They're just supposed to create a process through which we can adjudicate power, through which we can determine political outcomes. But here's the problem. Nothing is neutral, because systems and institutions are staffed by people. And people are not interchangeable parts. People are not NPCs. Well, some of them act like it, unfortunately, right? If they're just watching MSNBC all day long. But people are not neutral. People have worldviews. People have beliefs.
So that's one of so as we talk about what are the problems here, like one of the problems is liberalism. In your argument, liberalism presumes that you can have neutral institutions, and there's no such thing as neutral institutions because people generally by nature or experience or whatnot are not neutral.
Yes.
Now, okay. Let me put it this way, though. I'll push back a little on that. All of us have served in some capacity where we understood that even though we had individual ideas, concepts, notions, or whatnot, we still served in positions where we were fairly neutral with respect to the application of our duties. So for instance, when I worked at a pizza joint when I was 16, I did not see the pizza joint as, well, my job here is to evangelize for my faith and in the like open proselytization, right? Obviously you should always behave like a Christian, but I didn't see that role as, my job here is to convince everyone to be a free market, advocate. No, my job there was to make pizzas. And so that's what I did. And I try to make pizzas well. So why isn't, so the classical liberal looks at it and they goes, well, no, several times people, we may not be completely neutral. Sure. We have our own experiences. We have our own beliefs. But if we can also believe that the system operating in a neutral behavior is important, then that actually becomes its own value. And so now I can operate in a system to where, for instance, I have constituents. I have constituents that come to me with problems who didn't vote for me, who maybe don't like me. But I will give them, I will absolutely try to deal with their problem as I would somebody else. Why? Because they're still my constituent. And so if we're capable of making that kind of distinction, that in this moment, I'm not just, helping somebody that doesn't like me. What I'm doing is I'm living out my value, that my job in this position is to fulfill this duty. And so I don't think classical liberalism pretends that everyone's neutral. I do think it advocates for the idea that people have the capacity to identify a duty and operate in such a way that is just, even if it might not be their preferred outcome.
That's a good point, but the counter to it is, well, how's that working out for us? Because you're absolutely right in terms of what its intention is. Mm-hmm. But the problem is that what we have right now is, unfortunately, the side that wants to win will always defeat the side that simply wants to be left alone. Mm-hmm. Conservatives approach this with, we just want to be left alone, because the conservative take in the U.S. tradition, the right-wing take, as far right as you can go in the American tradition, is classical liberalism. That's where the right begins, and everything goes left from there. And so what we're doing is that we approach an issue, we approach politics from a position of, we want to be left alone. So they approach it, the left approaches it from, we will never leave you alone.
So do you also think the other neo-reactionary critique of classical liberalism is that classical liberalism, and this goes to your process versus outcomes, classical liberalism presupposes, and I presuppose, that there are certain systems, right, which are morally superior. So for instance, classical liberalism assumes that a system which allows for representation within government for the purpose of protecting basic, civil liberties, that is a morally superior position. Now, we've already seen what happens though sometimes when a nation which holds those values, a nation which holds those classical liberal values, then goes to another nation that doesn't hold those values and say, hey, we've got this morally superior system here, right? And it doesn't work. So is part of the critique then that it's all fine and good to hold these things up as morally superior systems, but if you try to apply them in situations for which they don't operate, you can't just sit there and keep insisting that it's morally superior.
Well, because everything is a negotiation. When you're looking at government, you have different factions who want different things, and they negotiate to come to some kind of a compromise, right? Well, when one side just wants to be left alone, they have nothing to negotiate with except wanting to be left alone. And so the other side shows up with their ransom list or their hostage negotiation list and is like, I want a chopper. I want $1 million cash delivered to whatever. And I'll give you a couple of these hostages and we're going to get away scot-free. And you're like, well, no, we're not giving you the helicopter. Okay, but you can have everything else.
Yeah. So
and so basically they don't get everything they want, but they get a giant amount of what they want. And guess what you get? You get nothing you wanted, which is why I believe that, maybe
don't go into
really
solutions too quick.
Hey, I might be agreeing with you, Christian, because listen, we need to come to the negotiating table the way the Democrats do. The left comes to the table like they're negotiating ransom and hostages, and they're the ones with the hostages wanting the ransom money from you. We need to show up the same way and be like, hey, look, Constitution says I have a right to bear arms. Therefore, I want this number of rounds delivered to me each month at government expense. And I want all of these guns at government expense. And the only way to negotiate back and forth is, well, maybe I get less rounds and maybe you get a little less of what you want. If I don't just want to be left alone, I have something to negotiate with, right?
And so, and again, I think this would actually be another neo-reactionary argument, because the classical liberal position is typically, well, no, your right to keep and bear arms does not mean the government has an obligation to provide it to you, because if they do that, then somebody else is going to be prevailed upon or be forced to subsidize or encourage something that they don't.
But the argument also
Wait a second. I got to finish the whole thought.
Okay.
All right. And so the classical liberal argument is we can't use the government to do X, Y, and Z because it could be used against us. And the neo-reactionary argument is, I got bad news, dude. It already is, and you got nothing to negotiate with.
Exactly.
The question, though, but the classical liberal will come back with and be like, well, no, that's not true. We do have something to negotiate with. What we have to negotiate with, I would argue that maybe the problem is it's not as sexy, but what we have to negotiate with is we're going to cut all of this, right? You want X, Y, and Z. We want to get rid of X, Y, and Z.
Which also has never, okay,
well, Javier Milei.
Listen, in the U.S., do we have a bigger or smaller government?
We've had a bigger government
20 years ago, 50 years ago.
Man, Tina's making my argument for me.
Ever since I know, I get it. I get the argument. The classical liberal response is going to be like, okay, yes, we get that the left has grown regardless of who's in power.
Which is because We don't have negotiation power. All we have power to do is cut whatever they have already forced through. And we can only cut what they have forced through
and then at
if
that point
they
you run
agree
out.
to it at the expense of something else they want.
Hegel is
And so-
undefeated right now, is what I'm
Well,
I'm hearing.
I think the argument is that the left never runs out of negotiating chips because they can
Exactly.
always come up with a new demand or a new grievance or a new interest
A new
group.
current
and
thing.
all we
Yeah.
have on the table is the threat of cutting something they've already had at the expense of something they want.
Okay, so what you're saying is that again, because the
It's
classical
all, they have all the chips.
Wait a second. So again, the classical liberal response is, okay, go tell that to the left in Argentina, because right now they're finding out real hard that no, that side can negotiate, and the way they've negotiated is by getting rid of all the stuff they set up. Your argument is that, okay, great. What happens when they've got rid of all of it? And now what do you got? Because if you don't want anything
We
returned.
just climb the mountain again.
Okay, so there you go. Fair argument. Now let me give you the classical liberal response. Okay. So what do you plan to do about that? Do you plan to just create a different government system where we're stealing from them to buy the stuff, to get the stuff we want, where we take from them to get the stuff that we want? And so basically what you're acknowledging is that there is no situation where different people with different mindsets can ever live in peace with one another while accepting that there's certain. Let me finish, please.
Sorry.
He's being a lot nicer than you are, where there's certain things that we can say, hey, look, this is not a role of government. What you're admitting to, or what you're suggesting, is everything ultimately becomes a role of government, right? It's just a question of what is the government enforcing.
I just
Sure,
want to
because the
clarify.
government will force. Government's going to force.
I just want to clarify something. It's not that the dissident right or neo-reactionaries or post-liberals are advocating for government subsidization of machine guns.
Yeah, I know that.
Right. And so I just want the audience to understand that is not the position. They're not saying we need to start pillaging. The Republic's being pillaged by leftists. We need to start pillaging the Republic. That is not what the neo-reactionary approach is to this. Their approach is far more philosophical than it is policy-based.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody in this camp is saying we need to start pillaging the Republic as well.
Yeah.
What they're saying is we need to take power and actually wield it in a way that defends that which we love.
Okay, but so
that
that's
sounds like classical liberalism.
Wait a
to me.
second. But no, so it's a little bit different. Classical liberals, like, the joke among libertarian circles is, libertarians desperately want power so they can leave you alone. The neo-reactionaries are like, oh, no, we're not going to leave you alone. We want the power.
Okay.
But here's the question. When you say we want the power in order to protect,
Right.
okay, how do you plan to do that?
What does that look like?
Because the dynamic that Tina already mentioned still exists.
Yeah. And if you're saying it's mostly philosophical, then, well, guess what? That's going to do a whole lot of nothing. I'm telling you, it's going to do just about as much as classical liberalism has, because both of these come from a philosophical mindset. So you tell me, in law, legally, what action actually gets taken through the force of government under a neo-reactionary that would not take place under a classical liberal? You have not answered that yet.
He hasn't.
I haven't had a
and I want you
chance,
to.
though.
But before you answer, I want to remind everybody, this is a devil's advocate episode, which means we're not, yes, Christian thinks that neo-reactionaries make some good points. That doesn't mean he agrees with every single neo-reactionary, but his job is to argue for the neo-reactionaries. So, Christian, what do the neo-reactionaries do?
A couple things. Before we fully jump into actions, I don't think I've yet fully articulated the nature of the problem entirely. I'm not going to read this entire thing, but I need to read parts of it.
Okay, go ahead. You can read parts of it.
There was this post, and I brought it up earlier in this podcast, where I talked about the nature of the problem. It was this circle post. They got over 100
Just get to the point. Nobody cares.
And here's the problem, right? I say I've changed a lot over the last 4 years, and even over just the last 2 years. I suppose it's only natural for some people who knew me 5 years ago to ask things like, whatever happened to the libertarian I once knew? What became of you? I became what's necessary. It's really incredible watching some libertarians quote theory to me when I ask them how they plan to stop the left. They have literally no answer to this question aside from stating the obvious. We just need to limit government. We just need to return to the Constitution. And there's my all-time favorite. If we wield power against our enemies, we will be setting a precedent to be used against us. And then I go on to say, do not quote libertarian theory to me. I've been espousing these same arguments since before I could even vote. Do you honestly think there's something in libertarian philosophy that I haven't already considered? If you're going to tell me that the only reason we shouldn't use state power against our enemies is because it might be used against us, I have news for you. State power is already being used against us. So what now? What's your solution? Vote harder? Appeal to the Constitution more? The left does not care about the Constitution any more than they care about appeals to setting dangerous precedents, checks and balances, federalism, or even social norms. Do you honestly think a political movement at war with biology and reality cares about appeals to social or legal norms? The left respects no limitations on power whatsoever. There isn't a single historical, legal, or social limitation on power that the left does not already demonstrate they aren't willing to violate. And you're telling me that the Constitution is going to save us? If the Constitution couldn't have prevented us from getting to this point, how could it possibly reverse what's already happened? The Constitution is a dead letter, and I'm tired of being attacked by people for pointing out the obvious. It's the problem with some libertarians, because their only response to the left's civilization-destroying excesses is complete unilateral disarmament in the face of an enemy that respects zero limitations on power and openly brags about it. It instead reserves its ire for the right whenever anyone dares to suggest that a response is warranted for the ongoing wholesale destruction of civilization. But the American right has become a suicide pact that prides itself on losing. Defeat is a virtue. To win requires violating their own principles. They see the act of losing to be one of the deepest expressions of principled opposition imaginable. In short, the right is afraid of power, and the left is addicted to power. And then we wonder why we are living in clown world. What drove me to abandon libertarianism over the last few, that's what drove me to abandon libertarianism over the last few years. It was the realization that not everyone respects the non-aggression principle and that you should ignore this fact at your own peril. We ought to crush our enemies, actually. They have made it abundantly clear that's what they intend to do to us. Libertarians may pride themselves on being the most principled person in the gulag, but I wasn't born to simply wallow in the shadow of the least capable, least virtuous, and least among us who are worthy of wielding power.
Dang.
That's beautiful, Christian. You should get that published.
Oh my gosh, Tina.
That's the approach that I'm coming from.
Okay. All right. So let's unpack some of that, because there's going to be certain things that we don't disagree on, right? Like, I don't disagree that, first of all, I also get frustrated with libertarians that just repeat slogans without any idea of how you're actually going to achieve it. One of my greatest frustration with libertarians is a libertarian, a lot of the libertarians I know will sit there and just kiss up to a leftist that agrees with them 10% of the time and excoriate a conservative that agrees with them 90% of the time. It's almost like the more a conservative agrees with the libertarian, the more they hate him. The less a liberal agrees with them, the more they love him and the more they try to pander to him. And so I understand that. I think the understanding is there's a lot of people that don't understand the nature of the fight. The nature of the fight is not over the top marginal income tax rate. The nature of the fight is not over who's going to pay for, interstate repairs. That's not the nature of the fight. The nature of the fight is the very role of not only government, but how we interpret reality at this point, right? Because the same person that is telling you, I should be able to take your kids away from you if you refuse to give them puberty blockers, right? That person is not somebody I can realistically share a country with. They're either going to have to be convinced that that is not an appropriate worldview, or we cannot peacefully coexist, because they will impose themselves on me in a way that I will not tolerate, right? So again, I think it is a fair critique of certain people within the classical liberal style. I don't think it's a fair critique of classical liberalism, because the person that's being true to classical liberalism looks kind of goes like, no, you're being aggressive toward me. I get to defend myself. I get to come back and fight, right?
But one of the black pill sort of things that you kind of sort of come to realize, and I don't know where this causes you to fall, but it does seem like liberals only respond to the biggest real threat. So let me explain what I mean by that. We have a lot of situations that have happened throughout history where liberals eventually become apologists for whoever it was that perpetrated an atrocity. For instance, 9/11. 9/11 happens. Liberals, at first they're like, oh my gosh, you attacked us. And they started sounding like conservatives for like a hot second. And then all of a sudden they started being like, well, we really had it coming, and stop hating on Muslims, and, Islam isn't bad. And now it's all about just, they love Islam, right? And so they'll label Christians as being semi-terrorist groups and Islamic terrorist groups as being like they're just oppressed.
Decolonizers.
They're just oppressed. And so you can look all over the place and see this type of thing at play with liberals, leftists, all the time, not classical liberals, but leftists. I have to change the way I say it. But, you even look at leftists are even trying to defend pedophiles at this point. So basically, if whatever you do to the liberal is bad enough and inflicts enough harm and pain, they will eventually side with you. That's what we're learning. Hold on. It's true.
I don't think it's true.
I don't think that's necessarily true.
I don't think that's true.
They eventually side with whoever poses the biggest threat. Do you see any feminists going over to some of these Arab countries and standing up for women there?
No. I understand what you're saying on how they look. I don't believe the left, especially the modern left, like the old left was capable of a fight, primarily because they didn't completely. They didn't go to war with masculinity, right? The old left used to actually uphold masculinity. The new left does not, and so you're right in the sense. You're right in the sense that they don't.
I would even assert it as far as big pharma goes. The left used to be hostile against pharmaceuticals, against big pharma, and then they became their apologists.
Okay, the
all
problem
big
is
pharma
this.
had to do is put their boot on their neck a little bit,
No, I don't
and
think
they became the apologists.
That is not what happened. Big pharma didn't put their boot on the neck of leftists.
Everybody.
They put the boot on us, right? There's a difference.
This gets into the problem.
There's a big difference here. It's not that the left responds. Yeah, I don't think the modern left is capable of defending themselves.
The left responds to the power.
Oh my gosh.
No,
So that's why
the left does not respond to any and all power. If the left responded to any and all power, then they would just be sitting on the side there crying. That's not how they do it. They have a particular worldview, and insofar as they believe somebody that can be useful for that worldview, then they will utilize them regardless of what their other ideologies are. That's why you will see the same left doing #MeToo 1 minute, right, pro LGBTQ, and then the next minute going, well, of course, a country which throws homosexuals off of the roof, right? Of course, those are the people that we're going to now build into our coalition. That makes no sense to us because we're looking for intellectual consistency across the board with respect to a worldview, right? With respect to a coherent political ideology. They're trying to seize power.
We're obsessed with process. They're obsessed with outcomes. And then we wonder why we always lose. This gets into my critique of liberalism. Liberalism is obsessed with process. Liberalism is obsessed with neutrality. Liberalism is also obsessed with individualism. And I mean a coercive type of, or a corrosive type of individualism. I don't mean the people should be free to, pursue their dreams and use their talents to their fullest type of liberalism. I mean the dissolving type of liberalism in the sense that you are now an atomized, your atoms in the void, separated from any connection to family, to culture, to country, to civilization. That is the negative type of liberalism. And so, negative type of individualism.
Yeah.
The problem with liberalism, and I mean this in the classical sense.
Yes.
The problem with liberalism is this idea that we can share a country where people want to push mutilating children in the name of transgenderism, but as long as we have these neutral political processes in place, we can sort these things out. No, we cannot sort these things out. I do not want to share a country with somebody who has that type of worldview. And you know what? They don't want to share a type of country with me. They know how to win, though. We don't know how to win because we're obsessed with theory. We're obsessed with process. They're obsessed with outcomes. This is how you get situations where they will espouse feminism on Monday and then they will espouse Hamas on Tuesday because they don't actually care about being consistent. Being consistent doesn't get the job done, and the job is acquiring power. I have another post that I wrote that I think really gets this point across. And I put this out yesterday, and I was amazed at the type of people that messaged me actually and said, you know, this kind of touched me. And I said, too many people on the right believe politics is something that it simply isn't. Politics is not the art of compromise or the art of the possible. It's not about finding common ground, nor is it about blind loyalty to a party like it's a sports team. Politics is the adjudication of power. It is the mechanism by which a society determines who rules whom. Karl von Clausewitz once famously argued that warfare is a continuation of politics by other means. The reverse is just as true. Warfare is the violent adjudication of power, while politics is the peaceful adjudication of power. But no matter how the process is settled, power has been and always will be adjudicated. There is no compromise or common ground on this question. It's a zero-sum game. Some people will rule and others will be ruled. It's only after the adjudication of power is settled that you can determine ways to achieve the possible. By running away from this fact and pretending that politics is something that it isn't, the right has too often abandoned the fight before it has even begun.
Okay, let me push back on two things here. One, I understand that outcomes are important, right? I also believe that philosophy is important, right? It's not that the left is completely devoid of philosophy. They just understand that the outcomes are critical if you ever want to see any sort of manifestation of your philosophy in practical terms. I think that's kind of what you're saying here, is that you have to adjudicate the power first, who's going to be in charge. Then you can start to talk about compromises with respect to what can actually be accomplished. The classical liberal position, I don't think, disagrees with the idea that, yes, some people are going to be in charge and some people are not, right? Or some people are going to have more say with respect to government and some people are not. The classical liberal position is simply a question of what is the best possible way in order to try to ensure justice within that system, justice within that process. So the philosophical principle that classical liberalism is going to is that if we are all endowed by our creator with certain unalienable rights, then at some point, right, it's 18 in the United States, at some point, you have some say with respect to the system that is going to adjudicate that power. That's the classical liberal response. Now, if the neo-reactionary response is to say they shouldn't have that, well, then the question is okay, so who does? Because I'm not convinced that I'm convinced there's a problem. I'm convinced that when you have a society that is sick, it will choose bad and ineffective leaders. I am certainly convinced as a Christian of the idea that we have a sinful nature which we have to combat against, and that can manifest itself in the sort of leaders that we select if we're not effectively combating against it, right? But what I hear right now is an understandable critique, especially because can we be perfectly honest? We have a lot of people espousing classical liberalism. We haven't been governed by a whole lot of classical liberals.
That kind of gets to my point.
Right? We've been governed by a whole lot of people that actually do like the idea of the centralization of power and wielding power and using it against their political enemies. Or let's not even say using it against their political enemies. Let's just say that they are so convinced that they are correct and they have no philosophical or moral problem using power, even if it's at the detriment of somebody else. They're so committed to their worldview that they believe that they should be able to use government to impose themselves. The classical liberal says, we realize that that is a problem which exists in every single human being. And so the primary question that we're trying to ask is, how do we minimize that? How do we minimize it? How do we mitigate it as much as possible? Now, let's talk real quick about the whole concept of representative government or democracy or whatever manifestation of that we want to include. Because I think there can be some good arguments there, one way or the other, on how we should proceed with that. But again, I get it. Classical liberals sometimes, especially certain ones, get too focused on philosophy and not focused enough on outcomes, and it ends up hurting us in the practical world. I don't think that means that we're wrong about the fundamental nature of what's going on.
Man, you keep forcing me to bring up old posts of mine.
Well, just read it. Just read it.
The lesson of politics, let alone of history, is that the strong have always prevailed over the weak. Sometimes the strong are righteous. Many times they are not. The weak give way all the same. To be on the left is to reject this iron law of history, either by simply pretending it does not exist or by assigning a sense of moral superiority to the weak. To be on the right is to accept the truth for what it is and to work towards ensuring the strong are righteous and just.
I agree with that.
The point that I'm trying to make, and we've used this analogy before, the ring exists.
Yes.
This is not, unfortunately, we do not live in the world of Middle Earth. There is no Mount Doom. Yeah. The ring exists.
I'm actually glad we don't, you said unfortunately, but I think that's fortunately, we don't live in that.
If you use the analogy and you say the ring of Sauron is not evil, it is power, because I actually don't believe that power corrupts absolutely. I think that power attracts those who are corruptible. Mm-hmm. I don't think that power actually does. And this is an important distinction because a lot of people on the right, a lot of classical liberals will say it's the Lord Acton quote, right?
Yeah.
Power corrupts. And absolute power
corrupts absolutely.
Corrupts absolutely. Lord Acton is wrong. And if you want proof of this, look at Washington and Cincinnatus. Washington was offered the crown. Cincinnatus was literally made a dictator. Cincinnatus had absolute power. Washington had the ability to seize absolute power. One of them took it and gave it away, and the other one rejected it. And so if we accept the proposition that absolute power, or that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, then the second that we look at history, we'll realize that we're actually wrong, because Washington and Cincinnatus are examples of how this is not the case. The reactionary approach to this is, to use the Lord of the Rings analogy, the ring is not actually evil. The ring represents power. And there is no Mount Doom for you to throw the ring away. There is no state of nature. There is no anarchy. I'm sorry, libertarian bros, you're wrong. Anarcho-capitalism cannot exist. Power will always be wielded. And to truly be on the right, and I've used this argument before on the podcast, there's many ways to divide left and right. You can say capitalism versus socialism, or free markets versus central planning. Another way is hierarchy versus egalitarianism. And the left are a bunch of hypocrites because there is no true egalitarian system.
Yeah.
In fact, they use hierarchical systems in order to impose their egalitarian vision. Yeah. They're hypocrites. If you're truly on the right, and I mean this in the actual true sense, not just in the classical liberal idea where it's the Constitution's as far right as you can go. To truly be on the right is to embrace hierarchy. But it doesn't have to be a tyrannical hierarchy where it's built by blood. It can be built by merit. It can be built by ability.
It can be built by merit. And one of the things, too, that we also have a problem is that some people automatically assume we see this all the time when I've seen conservatives say this, like, I think soldiers should make more than baseball players. It's like, okay, then you don't understand how economics works. If you really believe that, then you would voluntarily pay more in taxes for that. You don't believe that. But there's a difference between, meritocracy essentially is, the question is, okay, how do we establish merit? Well, the way that we've established merit within the marketplace is if you're the best at providing the goods and services that people desire, you make more money. People sometimes point out, well, but people cheat. Okay, but that's a violation of the system. That's always going to exist. People will point out that, but the person that sells, stuff that is bad for people. You're right. People can sell things that are very, very bad for people, and they can choose to make that person wealthy by voluntarily purchasing it. The question is what is the alternative? Right? That's the question with all of this. It's very easy to sit back and say, classical liberals, you got it wrong. Classical liberals, you're too focused on philosophy. I understand you're too focused on philosophy. What I want to know is, okay, great. What is the neo-reactionary response to that? How are you going to ensure that the power that is wielded by somebody that is going to use it for just and noble purposes? What is the neo-reactionary mechanism for achieving that?
The way that we do that is, it starts with, we need to get the right out of this mindset that power is synonymous with evil. Power is. It's not good nor evil. It is fire. Mm-hmm. Fire can be used to heat your house. It can be used to burn your house down. What we currently have right now are a bunch of people wielding fire to burn our house down. It's called leftism. It's cultural Marxism. We do not have people that are learning how to tame fire and use it to heat our homes, because the right is afraid of power, as I said earlier, and the left is addicted to power. And so the way that we fix this problem begins with the right, almost in a sense, in the Jungian sense, embracing their shadow, right? Or confronting their shadow. The right has to learn how to wield power in order to defend that which we love. And we know is critically important for the maintenance of
don't-
civilization.
I don't disagree.
They're afraid
with that.
of it right now.
Okay,
This is way too intangible for me. Let me just ask you a question. Tell me if this is neo-reactionary or if it's classical liberal. I'm going to name a couple of things. DeSantis in Florida passing legislation which basically enforces certain things, does not allow certain things.
You're talking about like when he removed Disney's tax exempt status,
or made the basically banned certain things.
You know how I would describe that? It was a classically liberal, acceptable manifestation of neo-reactionary response. Here's what it means. If he had said, Disney, you're no longer allowed to operate in Florida, that might fall within a neo-reactionary response. Disney, you present a worldview and a philosophy which is completely the antithesis of what we believe and want in Florida. I am the elected representative of the people of Florida. Get out. A classical liberal would say it's okay to take away their tax exempt status because they never should have had that sort of status in the first place. Is that fair?
Potentially.
Well, he's basically making Florida hostile for liberals, for leftists, I mean.
Well, and we need to be doing that.
The neo-reactionary position is to make wherever it is hostile to whatever they like. So basically, you're fighting against all of the transing of the kids with a bunch of child transition bills. You're making it hostile to people who like abortion and killing their babies by making abortion hard to obtain in your state. So are you talking like that? Because some of what you're saying is so up here in your head that doesn't have any policy linked to it at all. What are some policies that you've seen other people do that you would consider neo-reactionary? Name some.
Okay, so a couple of points. The reason that it's starting in this almost philosophical ethereal position is because the neo-reactionary dissident right post-liberal approach is not a popular approach. It is a minority within a minority within a minority.
Yeah, got it.
We're attacked by other people on the right. And so they bring up these criticisms because what they're trying to do is red pill the right into realizing you are not getting the job done. The conservatives are not conserving anything.
Yeah, got it.
Right? And so that's the reason why they start with
the criticism.
With the criticism. Because we need to still red pill a lot of people.
I'm a big fan of, you got to identify the problem before you start talking about a solution. Because if people aren't convinced there's a problem, well, then what are you talking about?
Now, to your point.
But it feels a lot like these are splitting hairs right here.
No, I don't think they're splitting hairs at all.
It feels that way policy-wise because I can't see a single policy aside from you saying
start
that
move toward that. To start moving
policy.
towards democracy. And when we did our first podcast last year where we actually covered neo-reactionary thought, and we brought up like the Politiball page, which was actually quite informative. And we talked about this. This is actually part of the reason why you see some, not all, some people within the neo-reactionary or dissident right or post-liberal position are monarchists. Not all of them, but a lot of them are, in part because they approach power from a different perspective than the classical right does. And they want to formalize power, and they want power to be in the hands of those that will wield power in order to defend, again, what I said, that which we love.
Okay, so that's okay.
That's a critique of democracy.
Well, this is a good distinction, right? So the classical liberal U.S. constitutional approach says we have suffrage. We could argue to what degree you would like universal suffrage, but we generally believe that suffrage is a good idea, right? We believe in the separation of powers between the executive and the branch, and we generally limit those, right? What I've seen of a lot of neo-reactionary philosophy is that that the separation of powers has gotten to the point, especially with the bureaucratic state, that our system has failed us because now we can't even be sure that our leaders are actually the leaders. We can't even be sure that they're ones responsible.
Joe Biden's not running the country.
For what's going on. So, great. And like you said, one neo-reactionary response to this is monarchy. Now, some people hear monarchy like, oh my gosh, a king.
Especially if they're an American.
Yes, right? And what the neo-reactionary might say is, well, I don't mean a king in the way that you think of it, like a hereditary style throughout it, or maybe they do. But
there's disagreement there. Lots.
Give an example. Give an example of if the neo-reactionaries could be in charge, right? If they were popular enough to be in charge, what do they replace or drastically alter our current government system with?
So the example that I like to point to is, I mean, first off, we live in a democracy. And when I say this, I already know people are typing, oh, no, Christian, we live in a republic, not a no, we live in a democracy. And I'm not saying this like somebody on the left that's ignorant. No, I'm saying this from a black pill position that it is unfortunate that is the case. I understand we were supposed to be a republic, but we are increasingly a majoritarian democratic system. And we've increasingly moved in that direction because we had the erosion of states' rights. We had the 17th Amendment. We've increasingly moved towards just a majoritarian system.
Yeah. Okay.
Democracy does not work, though, because democracy inherently ends up producing effectively the looting of the political system. Yes. We have a political party right now that is predicated on looting the republic, and it's called the Democratic Party. Democracy is an enabler to that because what they end up doing, Nick Land brought this up once. He was like, a thrifty politician is an incompetent politician, and such misfits will quickly be removed from the political gene pool.
Look, I'm gonna summarize this because I want to get on to the next part.
Okay, so
the summary.
Here's the solution. Right. The solution, one solution
that
I'll bring up. It's Curtis Yarvin's idea of neo-cameralism.
Okay.
So cameralism was the political system that Prussia had under Frederick the Great. And now Yarvin takes that system, but he doesn't apply it in a hereditary sense.
Yes.
Instead, this is where you get the neo part of neo-cameralism, because he would advocate for fusing it with basically a corporate, shareholder structure. Yeah. So the analogy that I like to use is Apple. Everybody knows that Tim Cook is the CEO of Apple. He gets to call the shots at Apple. He runs the company.
Yeah.
It's not like Joe Biden where he's president, but we know that Joe Biden's not running the country. Mm-hmm. The bureaucracy, the Leviathan's running the country.
Yeah.
Right? No, at Apple, Tim Cook is running the country.
Tim Cook can fire anybody in Apple. He
can change product design. He gets to sign off on any new products. And before him, it was Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs ran that company. But Tim Cook was responsible to the board at Apple. And the board is appointed by the shareholders. And the job of Apple is to return value to the shareholders of Apple.
Yeah.
And so the political analogy would be the job of the federal government is to, quote unquote, return value to its shareholders. What that entails is protecting things like property rights. It's maintaining many of the things actually in the Constitution. It's maintaining a sound currency. It's maintaining national defense. It's returning value to the shareholders. Who are the shareholders, though? They're people that have stake in the system. They're people that own the land. They're people that pay the taxes. They're people that are raising the children in the country. They're people that are willing to fight and die for the country. To use the Starship Troopers analogy. Yeah. The way that we can determine those who have a stake in the system as shareholders might be a combination of these things. And this is where you get disagreements or discussions about who should have those voting rights. I don't get voting rights at Apple because I'm not a shareholder of Apple. If I wanted to influence Apple, I would have to buy Apple stock to become a shareholder, because at that point I have stake in the system because I've invested in Apple. And if Apple goes to zero, I lose my investment.
Okay, I get that. Here's the critique. Here's the classical liberal critique. Great mechanism for a company because you don't have the authority to use legal force and aggression to take other companies' stuff. All right, but now what you've done is you've set up this corporate system, which is the most powerful corporate system in the world. And now the big question becomes, how do I get a piece of it? How do I get a big piece of it? More importantly, how do I get a controlling piece of it? Because with that controlling piece of the board, I get anything I want, right? Because I don't just have the guys with a lot of investors. I got the guys with the machine guns. That's a very, very different proposition.
You have to understand, and this is a fundamental difference between the neo-reactionary and classical liberal position. The neo-reactionaries are not afraid of power. Classical liberals will always point to these examples and be like, but these guys have machine guns. But the government might do this. Again, it gets back to the analogy. Power exists. The question is who is going to wield it. And now that does not mean absolute power. I am not advocating for Stalin. Mm-hmm. I'm not advocating for Hitler. I'm not advocating for Mao.
Well, keep in mind, nobody advocated for Stalin. Right? Well, Stalin became Stalin because of the conditions that were present and the political system that was present there. That's what the classical liberals have been desperately trying to avoid, and quite frankly, have been very successful at avoiding.
I do not think at all they've been successful. This is another critique. So, here's another tweet that I put out recently, and this really grinds my gears.
This
when
show
I talk
brought to you by Christian's Twitter.
If you don't already follow Christian's Twitter, please do so.
Go ahead.
You might not want to, because I put out some pretty based red pill takes from time to time. But
go ahead.
Anyway, I say a lot of people believe this is true, but I don't think it is. I say it's a myth that liberalism tolerates pluralism and allows for competing views. I wonder, does it still count as pluralism when AFD members are denied gun permits for their political affiliations? What about when members of the Canadian Freedom Convoy had their bank accounts frozen? How about when Nigel Farage was debanked? Or when Donald Trump was convicted of 34 felonies and a politically motivated sham trial? How pluralistic was it for the Spanish socialist government to make it illegal to pray the rosary in public? Liberalism pretends to set up neutral processes and institutions, but nothing is ever truly neutral. A side will always be picked. I'm just honest about which side I'm on.
Okay, here's the problem that I have with that, is that you're absolutely right that a system set up, like a classically liberal system set up in order to try to prevent the use of power in inappropriate ways, can be overrun by those who are elected in order to do it. Classical liberalism never purports that it is a perfect system which cannot in any way be corrupted or overwhelmed. The problem is that every single neo-reactionary alternative to that classically liberal system is just as susceptible to becoming corrupted or overwhelmed. The difference is that concentration of power actually allows them to engage in much more draconian practices. I mean, let's face it, the left in this country have had to spend decades trying to infiltrate systems and infiltrate higher ed and infiltrate the media and arts and entertainment in order to get to a point that even today, they're probably going to lose the next presidential election. And I fully recognize that the bureaucratic state that Donald Trump's going to inherit is still going to be a huge stumbling block in order to achieve any sort of genuine change that we would like to see. But I still have to say, wait a second, before we critique classical liberalism for not making everything perfect and rosy, can we please go back and look at some of the systems that are being recommended to us by the neo-reactionaries, which also failed to make everything perfect and rosy?
Couple things we need to understand, and we're going to be in agreement on this. There is no perfect system. We're in a fallen world.
Yeah.
We are trying to deal with the possible, not the utopia. We're not trying to construct utopia here. And we all know this.
Yeah.
Being on the right. So we're just in agreement there, right?
So point acknowledged.
There's no utopia. Second point, your concern about concentration of power is almost predicated on the idea that power's not already been concentrated. Power has been concentrated. It's in the hands of the Leviathan.
Sure.
And so when classical liberals come to a neo-reactionary and say, your problem is you support concentration of power, the neo-reactionary would respond with, no, that's not a problem. I'm advocating for power to be concentrated. The problem is that you are denying that power has been concentrated within your own philosophical and political worldview. Power has been concentrated, and I've listed examples here in this tweet of how the left, the Leviathan, the managerial class, have concentrated power into their own hands. Nobody elected them. Nobody voted for them. Nobody said, I consent to my own government outlawing me being able to pray in public. Nobody consented to my own government shutting off my bank accounts. Nobody consented to taking my children away from me and mutilating them in the name of a delusional transgender ideology. And yet all of those things are currently taking place in the West right now.
Wait a second.
So when classical liberals say, your problem is you're pushing concentration of power, my response is going to be, and your problem is you're denying that power has not already been concentrated and wielded against us. I'm just simply honest about wanting to formalize power in the hands of those who want to defend the worldview, the values, and the principles that I believe. You still believe that we can have this neutral process, these neutral institutions, and we're going to just sort it out democratically. No, somebody will hijack that system.
This is the part where we disagree about what classical liberals are acknowledging and are not acknowledging. So I'm on the classical liberal camp. What about me suggests to you that I haven't appreciated that power has been concentrated in ways that we never intended, don't want, and would like to certainly change? I absolutely believe that. What I don't understand from the neo-reactionary viewpoint is, once again, you're pointing out a critique, but then you're offering a solution which says we're going to concentrate the power more, but then we'll concentrate it into the hands of the people that will defend us. Oh gosh, yeah, the classical liberals never thought about this idea of
how has that worked so far?
We would like our people to be able to be the ones in Congress and the presidency and the judiciary. No, we absolutely want that. We advocate that for that. We believe there has to be an honest process in order to try to achieve that. And the whole purpose of trying to not concentrate power too much in the hands of one person or one small group of people is not based off of us being afraid of power as much as it is a long historical trend without human history that shows that when it is concentrated in too few hands or in one hand, it generally breeds corruption, violence. It generally breeds a situation where the very few people that now have any sort of access to power are the ones that get to corrupt the entire system. We don't believe that classical liberalism or the U.S. constitutional system set up a process where that's never possible anymore. We do believe that we've made one where it's been generally harder than it has been in other systems. And the question now is, for the classical liberal, we say, clearly things have gone wrong. What's gone wrong? And then classical liberals like me point to, well, the 16th Amendment, the 17th Amendment, the fact that the government has completely taken over education. And lo and behold, when you give all of your children over to the government for their education, they come home believing, you know, what's really good is the government. We need more of it, right? So we acknowledge where the problems are. We don't think the problems were the functional parts of the system that were set up, right? We think the problem largely, in our opinion, is no, we had a massive cultural shift. And this is where the John Adams quotes come into play, right? Our Constitution was made for a moral and religious people and is totally unsuited to any other. That's actually true of any system of government established. Any system of government which actually seeks to preserve some degree of individual liberty and self-determination must be rooted within a civilization and a society which actually holds those things up to be values, objective values, right? We have increasingly become a society that no longer holds those things up to be objective values. And what I would say to you is, I don't care what system of control you have, what system of government you have. If the society in which it is trying to govern no longer holds up those fundamental principles, a king ain't going to change it.
You mentioning that, classical liberals
Man, I love this.
not wanting to,
I do too, actually.
basically classical liberals not wanting to admit that power has been consolidated, so therefore you want to streamline and consolidate more. It kind of reminds me, I'm sorry to say, it reminds me of somebody who's anti-capitalist who points out crony capitalism as the reason they hate capitalism.
I understand why you're coming to that conclusion, but a couple things to clarify.
Yeah.
When I say I want the formalization of power, understand I'm not saying I want an absolute total state.
Sure.
Here's a good historical example that I give. And I'm not saying I'm endorsing these regimes, right? I'm using a historical example. The King of France and the Holy Roman Emperor had far less power and authority over the people of France and Germany of their times than the current government of Macron and Olaf Scholz do today. The current government...
How much of that is technological versus process?
A lot of it is actually predicated on process. It's not about technology, and here's the reason why. It's because the nature of the system itself. The King of France is the King of France, and nobody, unless you're the Jacobins, are going to overthrow him. Mm-hmm. And I think it's actually a travesty that the French... This is another thing, too. I want to undo the French Revolution.
Yeah, okay. But
like, the problem is that if you look at the history of... I'm going to use France as an example here. You could also use Germany as well. You can use the Holy Roman Empire versus the current German government that they have today under the socialists, the SPD coalition. Look at the power of the government of France in terms of managing people's day-to-day lives, interfering with their lives. The French government were not hijacking people's kids from them and then mutilating them and giving them transgender surgeries. The French government was not... You know what? The French government wasn't even shutting people down for espousing beliefs. Now, some beliefs, right? If you advocated for overthrowing the king, if you tried to assassinate the king, they'd come after you. But the French government didn't shut down people for, shut down bank accounts like they did with Nigel Farage. They didn't shut down bank accounts like the Canadian...
Okay, again, I'm going to go back to, you don't think Louis XIV would have done that if he would have had the technological ability to do it?
No, because why? his power's not threatened because it's inherited. He is the king of France.
Well,
he doesn't have to worry about imposing a transgender ideology on people in order to maintain power. The left maintains power because they're always coming up with a new current thing. The left didn't care about transgenderism 20 years ago, and now they do. And the only reason they do now is because they're always having to come up with a new current thing in order to maintain power, because leftism is a memeplex geared towards the acquisition and consolidation of power. They don't care about transgenderism any more than they care about the white working class or Jewish voters. They used to be huge fans of Jews and white working class voters. Now they hate both of them. And you know why? Because they've moved out of the oppressed category to the oppressor category.
Sure.
One for being Jewish and one for being white. And now they hate those two groups because you know why? Because the only way that they maintain power is they always have to come up with a new victim. They always have to come up with a new grievance. They always have to come up with a new current thing in order to maintain power.
Okay, so
Louis doesn't need to come up with anything because he was born into the power. He doesn't need to mutilate any children. He doesn't need to shut down any speech except for the speech that is literally calling for his head to be chopped off. That's the only thing that he needs to worry about, is maintaining his own head on his shoulders. And when you look at the power of the French government under the Ancien regime and the amount of influence, the amount of 1984 type influence and control over people's lives, and you compare that to the regime of the Jacobins, or you compare it to the current French Fifth government today, it is night and day. The current French government today is far closer to 1984 than anything Louis could have ever dreamed of. The current regime in Germany, where they're trying to outlaw the second most popular political party because they're a, quote, threat to democracy, and they're trying to throw them in prison and deny them gun permits because they disagree with their political worldview, is way more authoritarian, way more absolute than anything the Holy Roman Emperor could have ever dreamed of.
Okay, but here's the problem. I think to some degree you're also cherry picking your monarchs, right? Because you can go to other leaders that survived in hereditary titles, and here's the two things that you're going to have to acknowledge from a historical standpoint. One, simply because they took power from a hereditary base did not mean that was a guarantee, especially within those like imperial or monarchical systems where you had harems and stuff like that, and you have multiple brothers competing for everything else. Not to mention the fact that in most of these cases, right, you also had, especially in France early on, you had very, very powerful lords. And so, yeah, the king in some of these cases later on became an absolute monarch, but in many cases...
And I'm not advocating for an absolute monarch.
But in many cases, didn't have a great deal of power because you had nobles that actually had their own retinues and whatnot that could fight against the king. So there were checks and balances on even monarch power. Now, the other thing I'm going to have to say that I completely disagree with you on here is that if you have a monarch, right, who hereditary title, and that's the culture to some degree believes that it's legitimate that the firstborn son of the monarch becomes the next monarch. That is still predicated on a civilization, a people that believe that has value, right? Of course. Culturally believes that has value. The moment they don't, or the moment they start to question it, or the moment their circumstances change to such a degree to where they no longer like the people in power, or they lose the mandate of heaven, or whatever it is, right? If we're using the Chinese example, yeah. All right, there's always a problem there that the chief executive has to contend with. And so when you say, well, wait a second, the modern day governments right now, the fact that Justin Trudeau can just shut down your banks because he doesn't like the way you're protesting and everyone goes along with it, that's far more authoritarian than anything the King of France in the 18th century could do. That may be true because the King of France didn't have the technology to actually do that. I think if you take today's technology and you hand it to the monarchs and dictators of old, you are not going to get a better result because, we're a little bit more secure in the transition of power. I think they're going to find they're going to have new mechanisms. They're going to have new mechanisms that they get to use in order to concentrate, consolidate, and retain power because even they knew that people were always coming for it.
This is the difference between advocating for dictatorship and advocating for a formalization of power. I am not advocating for a dictator. Believe it or not.
What does formalization of power even look like? Because from where I'm sitting, I look at the classical liberal who's basically treading water trying to keep this Leviathan from
they're drowning.
Demolishing everything. Okay, drowning. Your side doesn't exist at all in government at this point. A monarch is a thing of the past. Do you really think that can come?
Well, I mean,
hold on. Do you really think that can come back?
This is why I said I want to undo the French Revolution.
Okay, but without a time machine and a lot of manpower, you're not doing that. So you're going from a losing position to an even losery loser position.
No, I don't.
Because there is no situation where that will ever happen in your lifetime.
I want to point a few things.
So choosing that to be, here's how I'm going to fix everything is basically like
cosplay.
Nothing. It's LARPing.
Okay. If I went out there and said everybody needs to become monarchs, and I started advocating for legitimism and bring back Louis the 20th, sure, you can argue that that's cosplaying.
Well,
but
once upon a time, people would have looked at our current system of government and said, "There's no way that could ever happen," and yet here it is. So,
well, yeah, that's true too. I mean, in the 1780s, who would have thought that? Oh, you're going to bring back the Roman political system, pre-empire political system. I understand that though that there's a difference between dictatorship and Plato actually talks about this with his systems of government. He says that the dictatorship is illegitimate, but monarchy is legitimate. And the point that Aristotle was kind of in the same mold as this, right? Plato talks about this in the Republic, where he talks about we needed a philosopher king. Aristotle says many of the same things. Understand that there's a difference between a formalization of power and simply whoever, it's to the strongest, right? So understand, I'm not advocating for a Franco, right? Or a Pinochet.
Yeah.
That's an example where you just have a dictator. And even if it's a dictator that's cracking down on the Marxists,
this has existed already before, and this reminds me of the people who will be like, "Well, real communism has never been tried. Real socialism's never been tried.
Real monarchy has been tried in it, and you know what? They weren't chopping people's kids' genitals off under real monarchies.
They weren't transing them or chopping off their heads for
not paying their taxes.
Come on,
they would chop off their heads if they were revolution. And first,
or if they were an out of favor wife
at the end,
or different religion.
I'm not advocating for Anglicanism either. But if you want a true return to Christianity, what you'll probably need is either Catholicism or Eastern Orthodox, in my opinion. I think the Protestant Reformation was also
we're not going to get.
That's a whole other discussion.
So here's what I want. Here's what I want, because we're already past an hour on this, and we need to kind of.
I love this.
I do too, but we need to kind of sum it up. Here's what I want to know. So you don't want a dictatorship. You want the formalization of power. I'm going to tell you, we already have the formalization of power. You want a different formalization of power. So explain that structure again and do it in a way that where the audience can. You already talked about this idea of like you got a CEO with a board of directors and then you got shareholders. Mm-hmm. And so I assume what that would be like is something where you have, the head of the company who, I don't know, are they selected by the board? Are they selected by the like?
So let's get into this a little bit more, because again, when a lot of people think of monarchy, they think of Louis XIV. I am the state. That is not the type of monarchy that I'm advocating for.
So we've heard all about what you're not advocating for.
Sure.
Yeah. You have yet to tell us what you are. Tell us how. How do you take this country we currently have and successfully turn it into what you want it to be?
Oh, you don't. We implode, and then it might turn into what I want it to be.
So the country. Stop. So look,
there's no way to do this right now.
We're putting kind of an unfair criteria on them, right? The big thing is we're talking about, to some degree, we're talking about ideals as well. So here's the idea: if the country's imploded, we've had a sovereign debt crisis, and we're now like, all right, guys, we all got to meet together. The last win, that last go didn't work. What are we doing this time? What are you doing?
It can't be done until then, because
Christian,
the U.S. was built on classical liberalism and Enlightenment values.
Yes.
And
all right, so what are we doing?
He says, I will no longer be warlord in training. I will just be warlord.
I volunteer myself as king. No, I do not. No, we actually need somebody like Nick to be the CEO
what are we doing?
monarch.
What are we doing?
Here's
a concept.
Here's the concept, especially if you pride yourself on talent and merit.
Yes.
I'm not advocating for nobility of the blood. I'm not advocating for hereditary monarchy.
Pinning you down on this has been so hard. It's like you don't want to commit.
It starts with voting, and this gets into my critique of democracy.
Who gets to vote?
The only people that, first off, universal suffrage and its consequences have been a disaster.
So universal suffrage is gone.
Universal suffrage is out. Democracy is out. The 17th Amendment is out. States need to have power.
We don't even have.
States.
Well, I actually want states though, because that's more in the Holy Roman model. There needs to be a decentralization, because again, no absolute power. There needs to be decentralization.
Okay.
So like under the Holy Roman Empire, you had the HRE emperor, but you had individual princes and bishops and
You're
kings.
killing me. We got the 50 states.
Voting rights need to be predicated on who has stake in the system. So a combination, and I'm just throwing something out. There could be. People can pick and choose from this, right?
Okay.
I think it needs to be a process of military service potentially being, an entry point. It needs to be net tax paying as a potential entry point. Land owning or property owning needs to be a potential.
Well, and again, property owning was, in some cases, the reason why that was utilized is because it was the primary mechanism for which taxes were collected. So, all right, so essentially what you're saying is, so the conscription model is kind of is predicated on this idea that if you have a stake in the game and actually defending the security of the state, you now get a say on the running of the state.
Yes.
The taxes is also the idea, like if I'm a net taxpayer, and that's an important distinction, because now what we're saying is that if you can have a say on how the state is run and not have to contribute, you just get, well, then now you have a perverse incentive with respect to how you want the state run. So you're saying have to be a net taxpayer. That's another mechanism for you to have a vote. Okay.
The entire goal is what I'm trying to come up with is the entire goal is to avoid the creation of the Democratic Party.
Okay. All right. Because let's just focus. Let's just focus in.
No, I'm getting somewhere with this.
It's not that you're trying to prevent freeloaders and looting.
I'm trying to prevent what Bastiat warned about with plundering.
Okay. So now we've established the people that can vote have maybe conscription requirements and they're net taxpayers. Okay. So now that's the pool of voters. Who are they voting for at the federal level or whatever?
At that point, I think that really, because I want to create as many separations between popular vote and actual executive authority as possible. So what I would advocate for is more like a executive that's elected by a body rather than elected by the people. So in Apple's case, right, the CEO is not elected by the shareholders.
Yeah.
And the CEO is certainly not elected by the people that buy Apple products, right? The CEO is elected by the board.
Okay.
And the board is elected by the shareholders. In the HRE system, you had the emperor was elected by the prince electors. And he wasn't even elected by every single prince. He was just elected by a handful of electors, like the King of Bohemia and Palatinate and stuff like that. So the way that I would advocate, just myself, right? And again, there's a lot of variation, but I think that you need an executive that's almost like elected by the Senate, that itself is appointed by state legislatures.
So let me see if I can try to provide this in language that everyone can kind of understand and relate to. So I am now a voting citizen. And when I go and vote, I vote for my state legislature and, maybe my governor, maybe whatever. That state legislature, when it comes to the federal system, that state legislature now has a vote, maybe based off of the size of the state, or they have so many votes or so many electors that now get selected to do the chief executive. But what you're saying is that you don't want just temporary electors. You're saying that, so let me ask you this. Does Congress still have two bodies or does it only have one now?
I think bicameralism tends to be a better thing than a more negative thing. I think that we have a better system than some of these European countries.
So who is electing the people that go to that bicameral federal Congress?
He's getting rid of the...
So first off, the Senate should not be elected by the people. The Senate needs to be elected by the states because that's the only way that you can preserve federalism.
Okay.
So just set that aside. We need to get rid of the 17th Amendment. I'm adamant about that. The House, I'm not necessarily against people electing the House, but again, it gets into the whole... I don't believe in universal suffrage.
Okay, stop. We've already established that. So now I show up to the polls, I vote for my state legislature or whatever based off of whatever my state rules are.
Yeah.
When it comes to federal, I am voting for essentially one person, and that's my representative in the House of Representatives.
Yes. It's similar to what the founding fathers originally envisioned.
Okay.
Right?
So how do we get this? The Senate, now the state legislature appoints the senator.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. How do I get to president?
So understand, I'm just trying to come up with this on the fly.
If you caveat one more time, I'm going to throw my mug at you. Just say something.
Okay.
Like neo-reactionaries are a thing, and they're like Wikipedia has a page. We could just ask what the definition
Yeah,
is.
but that doesn't necessarily mean that.
Yeah, try that. You're not going to be happy.
Yeah, that doesn't mean that they're going to have their own government
next?
model
What happens
constructed.
next?
In my opinion, the president needs to be. This is crazy because there's a lot that I disagree with the guy. A lot that I disagree with the guy.
This is Alexander Hamilton.
Alexander Hamilton.
I know what he's going to say.
Might have been right when he
So it's
advocated for a
presidency.
lifetime presidency.
Okay, but who?
He's wrong about the bank.
So who elects the president?
I think that the legislature, similar to again how in the HRE it was the prince electors that elected.
Okay. So the House and Senate.
Maybe some combination where it's just the Senate, or maybe it's a combination of the House and the Senate need to come up with an executive figure. But
you're not talking about parliamentary democracy where now like the prime minister is like the head in the House you're saying that there's still two separate entities.
Yes.
But they appoint the president, and whoever they appoint to the president is the president for life. What are the mechanisms? What are the legal mechanisms to remove him from power?
I think you could still have like an impeachment process, right? And if you think about it from this standpoint, if you remove democracy from the process as much as possible without it getting just straight up oligarchy or tyranny, which I don't want either of those. But if you take away some of the democratic excesses of the system, you've now, in some ways, attempted to depoliticize the president as much as possible by also enshrining a much longer term in office, right? You've now depoliticized the president as much. And you also have to understand the only way the system would work is if you kill the Leviathan. You eradicate as much of the federal bureaucracy as possible. This is why a lot of reactionaries like systems like pre-revolutionary France or pre-revolutionary Germany.
I need to stop you real quick because now we're talking about like, okay, I've showed up to the polls, I voted for my state, functions based off of whatever the state law is, right? My state legislature has appointed my senator, right? I voted for my member in the House of Representatives. What we just described is what the United States system used to be like before the 17th Amendment, by the way, just so in case anybody thinks that's absurd. I just described what the U.S. used to be like before the 17th Amendment. So for the first over 100 years of the country's history.
Which is part of the reason the U.S. has been one of the greatest countries in all of human history.
The part where it gets a little, the part where it goes off the tracks from what we currently have is now where it comes to the selection of the president. Now, here's what people also need to understand about how electors used to work. You were not voting for the president. In the earliest days of the American Republic, you weren't voting for the president. You were voting for electors you trusted to then debate with other electors on who should be the president. There was no obligation. There was no guarantee that the elector you voted. There was no legal guarantee that the elector you voted for would select the person you wanted for president. You were selecting the person that you trusted to go and negotiate and to work with other people in order to determine who the president should be. So apparently, so far, what I'm hearing is the neo-reactionary position is the original classical liberal position that our founders established.
Not quite, because understand that classical liberals will embrace democracy increasingly, right? Classical liberals say that, well, the expansion of suffrage was a good thing. I see so many Republicans that are like, oh, it's a good thing that we expanded universal suffrage to the point that it is now. No, it's not.
But you would have had other classical liberals that would have said, no, there's problems with that. Like Bastiat used to talk about the issues of properly understanding the implications of universal suffrage and what does that mean. And Bastiat likes to point out there is no such thing as universal suffrage. You don't let 4-year-olds vote.
Yeah.
So you don't have universal suffrage. We all acknowledge there needs to be limits on it. The question are where are the limits?
Is where are the limits?
Yes.
Of course. He uses the analogy in France because there was a debate over women's suffrage at the time. And he was like, regardless of the positions that both sides are taking, we understand that there is, like you said, there's no such thing as universal suffrage. We're trying to figure out where to draw the line because a 5-year-old can't vote.
Yeah.
And obviously, over time, eventually we drew the line and said, well, women can vote, but obviously, 5-year-olds can't. Although I would point out the left wants to lower the voting age now to like 16.
And there's a reason for that.
And understand, I'm not saying that voting should be based on gender or race or something
we already
like
established
that, right?
We already established
I think it's based on merit. It should be, again, it gets back into the whole, have you put it, or do you have,
skin in the game?
Skin in the game.
I wouldn't say it's merit so much as it is a shareholder concept.
Yes.
And I don't necessarily have a problem with, like, I understand the reasoning behind shareholder concept. The reason why you get a say is because, not just because it impacts you in some sort of esoteric way, it directly impacts you. They can send you to the war, they can take your money, therefore X, Y, and Z. Mm-hmm. So here's the question though. So explain to me how this position is different than what the classical liberals set the United States up to be.
One, the president, I think it's a mistake for the president to be closely elected to the system that we currently have, right? Where it's like the people do. We're very close to
but it didn't used to be that way. It used to be the electors.
Technically did not used to be that way, but remember how I advocated for the president to be elected by the legislature. By the Senate,
but again, we haven't
House.
Articulated what that would look like.
Of course, but you have to understand, I have not constructed I've not created Christian Stan, right? I like you're advocate. Here's the problem. I'm being asked to create a country from scratch in an hour and a half.
Well, no, you're not. You're not. Wait, you're not.
What you're being asked to do is to give a comprehensive explanation for what a neo-reactionary wants to see happen, just like Nick gave a comprehensive explanation for what a classical liberal wants to happen.
Sure, and the one-line answer, Tina, to that is, I believe in the same thing that every decent, rational human being, 99% of them believed before the French Revolution. That's ultimately what I'm trying to advocate for. Now, you can play around with that. You can say, well, we won't have nobility by blood or hereditary. We'll come up with a system that'll enshrine a meritocracy, that'll enshrine skin in the game, because there are obviously issues with the pre-revolutionary, 17th, 16th century, 18th century system of government.
Yeah, there's a reason there was a revolution.
I would also point out, though, that, you know what? Look at the way that we were governed under the British Crown versus the way that we are governed today. The Founding Fathers staged a revolution over a 3% tax. There's other differences, and we did a podcast about this. There's plenty of other differences.
27.
They tried to enshrine what they believed as their legal rights as Englishmen, right? Yeah. There was a concept of English liberty that they thought was being infringed upon, and they wanted to reassert that. But look at the system that we have today. Look at the government that we're being subjugated to today. Look at what Samuel T. Francis called the anarcho-tyranny that we live under today.
But
I think some of the founding fathers, if they saw the world today, they would have gone back to the British and be like, we need to work out a deal because things are not working out too well.
Until they would have saw the UK today.
No, and then they would have been talking about the system that existed at the time of the revolution.
But we don't live back then anymore, and so that's kind of the problem.
I get that.
Is we want to look at something with an antique mindset when we have everything is modern. There is no way to marry these two things.
Okay, this gets into a whole different topic about the problem with modernity itself.
Yeah, I don't necessarily think...
We say as we're on a podcast filming and streaming to YouTube.
I don't mean the problem with technology.
Wait a second. Yeah, modernity is a little bit different than just modern technology. But the other issue is this, right? I think it is always a dangerous proposition to say that could never happen, right? Like, you'd be shocked at historically what is actually can happen and what people are capable of, and obviously technology plays a major role in that. And we're gonna sum up here, so I'll let you have your final say, and then I'll have mine and whatnot. But I do think it's important. I think it's important for people to be able to flesh out ideas that are different from what we currently have, that appeal to some sort of historical standard by which we can judge the ideas, and suggest that maybe with a tweak here or a tweak there, it could be different. I think that's an interesting conversation. I think it's a worthwhile conversation. That's why I don't want to just look at what a lot of the neo-reactionaries are saying and say, oh, that's ridiculous. The number one thing that we keep coming back to, though, is that I think the neo-reactionaries have been very, very good at the critique. But every solution that I see them offer, I can go back to the same historical examples and say, wait a second. Yeah, you can claim, well, the Holy Roman Empire existed for 800 years. Okay, but how many people wanted to live in it, right? Like, you can also look at that and say, well, wait a second. And it might have worked out very, very well for the ruling class, or it might have worked out well for certain politically connected people within the Holy Roman Empire. But I think it's also fair to say that there's a reason why so many of the founders that we admire in the original system that they set up, that we admire with certain exceptions, they wanted to avoid the Holy Roman Empire because they saw certain problems within the fractionalization and the uncertainty that came with that. You can always say, oh, but they had successions. They had a ton of civil wars over those successions, very, very brutal civil wars. They had, in many cases, a lot of arbitrariness of law that our founders were trying to prevent. And so I do believe that this is a complex problem. And again, they like, just kind of one more thing on this, like, sum up what you think would be like on a not just on a philosophical level, and not just as a critique of the current setup. What do you think would be better about a neo-reactionary response as opposed to a preservation of more of a classical liberal approach? What do you think would be distinct and better?
I think the biggest thing that would be distinct is, in some ways, it would open the gates to not everything having to be politicized. Because we live in a hyper-political world where everything's an existential battle. And the reason why is because we live in a democracy, and it's I win or you lose. The left understands how power works and the right doesn't. As I said before, the left is addicted to power and the right is afraid of power. And that's why we're always losing. I think that power...
How would the right wield power under a neo-reactionary government differently than how they wield it now?
They would wield it similar to the way that we wield it within our own circle community. So we've told people, this is our intentional community. These are the values that we believe. This is the worldview that we hold. And if you don't agree with that, that's fine. You don't have to be a member of this community. But we believe in these things. We uphold these values, and that's what this community is about. And I think that the biggest problem that I see is we don't have a country. We have an economic zone. We have diametrically opposed worldviews between us and the left, and I brought this up earlier. The problem is that we're too afraid to enforce our worldview because we think enforcing a worldview is an act of tyranny. They think enforcing a worldview is perfecting humanity.
So
it's bringing about utopia.
So if we're putting a pin in this, right, or not a pin in this, but if we're nailing this down, is nice a vision of the world as classical liberals have, as they would like to try to create, as they've tried very, very hard to create. That's just not the way it works.
That's not how the world
and the way it works is power is going to be wielded and preferences are going to be enforced, right? Not just processes. Preferences are going to be enforced. And if that's the way it's going to work, then I want my side to be the one enforcing the preferences. Is that a fair?
One side will win. Let it be ours.
Okay. Okay. Look, I think that's a fair manifest, or a fair kind of synopsis of kind of it's something of a tragic vision, right? And we talk a lot about this. The conservatives are usually, Thomas Sowell wrote about the tragic vision versus the vision of the anointed.
It's hard because it doesn't seem like it's fully fleshed out. It doesn't seem like it's like
Tina, you know what is fully fleshed out though?
I feel like you kind of
liberalism is fully fleshed out.
Wait a second.
But the point I'm making is throughout this entire podcast, it was very hard to pin you down to what does that mean now? Like, what does that mean in action that you will take in government now? No.
We're jumping the shark though, and the problem why, and I tried to bring this up earlier. The problem is that the dissident right, the neo-reactionaries and the post-liberals, they're not even a majority within the right. They're trying to fight a battle with a side that's punching right and pandering left and trying to tell them maybe you should stop punching right and pandering left, and then every time the right punches right and panders left, and then they wonder why the roles are reversed. And that's the biggest problem. The problem is not, well, Christian, you haven't constructed a constitution yet. You don't have a solution to this problem. No, but you know what? I've identified the problem, and the right is delusional about what the problem is, and I'm trying to explain to them why they're being delusional about the problem.
I feel like it was difficult to get you to even name one law you would want to pass aside from getting rid of universal suffrage.
Can I say?
But I'm saying, like, what does that look like on the ground to the people that want to trans the kids? What kind of law are you putting in place?
Okay, fine. You want me to blitz through it? We're at the end here.
Blitz.
You want me to blitz through it?
Blitz through it.
It starts with mass deportation of every illegal immigrant into the country. It starts with shutting down almost every single federal department, firing almost every single federal bureaucrat. It starts with criminally charging and imprisoning Democrats who have committed even one hair out of place in order to tell the other side, you know what? You've unleashed mutual assured destruction. We'll give it to you, baby. because you want to game the system and throw our presidential nominee in prison in order to change an electoral outcome, we'll happily oblige. You know where else it involves? It involves shutting down the left whenever they want a permit for something, whenever they want a parade for something, whenever they want an LGBTQ, anything in public. You know why? Because they don't believe in freedom of speech. I'm happy to oblige you. It starts with banning abortion wherever you possibly can and sending a message to the left. No, you're not welcome into our state. You're not welcome imposing these values into our communities. We will actively be hostile to you because you know what? We're applying the friend-enemy distinction the same way you've applied it to us. We've foolishly believed that we could be friends with you, that we could coexist with you. You even have it on your cars as bumper stickers. We see what your idea of coexistence is. It gets back to what I said earlier. You can call me a reactionary all you want because I've seen what you call progress. That's where it starts. That's not where it ends. You know where it really ends? It ends with us enforcing our worldview on this country, because this country was not created for people to have their children stolen from them and be mutilated. This country was not created for us to be imprisoned for praying in front of an abortion center at the same time that the president of the United States is flying a religious symbol in front of the White House and proclaiming whole months of the calendar to be religious festivals in favor of degeneracy. This country was not created in order for the people that have lived here for centuries to be denigrated for living here because of the color of their skin or the country that their ancestors came from. The left despises everything about this country and wants to turn it into Maoist China. And you know how you defeat that? You tell them no. That's how you defeat it. You don't say, wow, imagine if the roles were reversed. You don't say, oh, let's just live and let live. No, you defeat it by defeating them. That's how you defeat it.
Just should have pissed him off an hour and a half ago.
I know, geez. We finally got there. Christian. All right, Nick, wrap us up.
I knew you could do it, baby. Well, look, so for the classical liberal side, here's what I think it comes down to, and I've kind of made this argument consistently the whole way through. We already have a formalization of power. The question is, and the problem is that we've strayed from it. Just like all the people that have formalized power, whether it was in monarchies or whether it was in different forms of monarchies or oligarchies or dictatorships or whatever the process was by which power was adjudicated, all of them are capable of corruption. The question is, do you have a society and civilization that holds up the values necessary in order to be able to protect against it? And the reason why I've emphasized so much that politics is downstream from culture is exactly because I believe it is. That doesn't mean I don't believe politics plays a role in shaping culture, and certainly can, especially the more authoritarian and dictatorial your society becomes. In fact, I think one of the things that in some ways kind of frustrates the left is they like the idea of culture informing politics until they control the politics. Then they want the politics to determine what culture can be. And so that's what we're trying to fight against. And the whole classical liberal project has been about this idea that, look, it's not that Lord Acton was correct in an absolute sense. Obviously, we have had people throughout history which have been able to utilize power and then give it away, but they've been far and few between. And I can tell you right now, power does have a corrupting influence. It doesn't mean that it will impact everybody the same. And I think Christian's absolutely right when he says that part of that corrupting influence is it also attracts people prone to such corruption. So I think all of that's valid. But I think that we can address so many of the problems that Christian has pointed out, which I think are valid problems within the system that we have. Now, the question is, why haven't we? Well, there's times when we have. It's just been a long time. And it has been a long time because if you look at the whole progressive era, the reason why we are living in an era now where we are dealing with so many problems, this didn't happen overnight. It happened because at the very seeds of the progressive era, especially with the Wilson administration, between things like the 16th Amendment, the 17th Amendment, but it wasn't just that, right? It was this whole social gospel theory within the United States, which told churches that no, we have to rely upon the government to be able to provide some of these essential services, which used to belong to the family, the community, and the church. They empowered the government in such a way to where government could never give up that power. And that became because that became a cultural theory, it became the predominant political theory. And that's when you start to see those changes in the United States Constitution. That's when you start to see this massive change in the way that people saw their role and their position with respect to the government. That's where you started to create massive incentive structures, perverse incentive structures within our government that saw people saying, wait a second, I can live off the public dole. I can live off the expense of my neighbor's hard work. And not only will I not be chastised for it, politicians will seek me as an interest group. And then in order to get me to continue to do it, they will elevate me within society. And so you're right, all of those critiques, both of what the left is currently doing, what the left has been doing, and the fact that classical liberals allowed for it to happen because we realized way too late that culture is also something that has to be continually fought through those culturally shaping institutions. That's where we failed. I don't think we fundamentally failed within our system of government. I think we fundamentally failed within the culture, and the problems that we're seeing now are a result of that. So I don't want to change the very nature of that system. I do want to reintroduce the way that it was originally designed, because the way it was originally designed, with certain exceptions, was set up specifically to prevent what we're seeing now happen. That's what they were warning us about. And I don't think that we're going to solve it by replacing the system with one which concentrates even more power or puts somebody in charge for lifetime appointments at the executive branch. I do think it's worthwhile to talk about what do we mean by universal suffrage. And I do think it's valuable to say it doesn't make sense to have a system where some people can take from the system but never have to contribute back into it. That is obviously wrong. That is obvious nonsense in anywhere else in life except for this one. And that does need to be effectively addressed. The other thing that I think is important, and this goes back to what I think the primary distinction is. I think the primary distinction came out in the last speech that Christian just gave, and that is, to what extent do you use power to punish people for believing things that you disagree with, and not just disagree with, but that you think are fundamental threats to the well-being of civilization? And that's a difficult question, because I am absolutely dedicated to my Christian faith, and part of what my Christian faith tells me is that I cannot impose it upon you. But I can look at other things within society and I can say, that's been detrimental. There's no question it's been detrimental. There's no question that a variety of things, whether it be drugs or porn or ideological movements within this country, Marxism is an absolute existential threat to the United States. And yet we allow for it to fester and become popular within our institutions of higher education. Classical liberalism says, but you have to allow it to be discussed. Because even when the state comes in and says, we're going to ban this, have you really banned it? Or you've just changed the way that the interest is generated in it? Now, the new actuaries come back and say, well, good theory. How's it worked out for you? And that's a fair critique. I just don't know that their response would be better. By the same token, I do think that there are certain elements that you just mentioned, which are ones that we can't effectively address. You don't get to mutilate children. And not only should we make that illegal, we should put you in jail for long sentences if you do it. I am all about freedom of association. And one of the reasons why our government was set up to allow the states to have far broader powers than the federal government ever was intended to was so that we could have freedom of association, so that Florida did not have to be governed the way California is. And the one thing where I think there's significant crossover here in what we do believe is that as a classical liberal, I do think it's about time that we start going after the very things which challenge the fundamental nature of what it is to be free and what it is to live in a free republic. Now, the lines are going to get blurry on some of that. What should you allow for? What should you not allow for? Should the government allow for any definition of marriage? Should the government get out of marriage altogether and not have a say in the institution? Should it elevate one aspect, or should it elevate marriage in between certain groups more than it does others? Those are some of the questions we got to ask. And I don't admit to knowing all the answers on it. Myself 5 years ago would have been, the government doesn't get involved in this stuff. You allow for individual choice. The one thing that I have been convinced of is that certain things always seem to indicate other things. And if you're running around with certain flags, if you're advocating for certain positions, if you're demanding certain things be accepted, if you're advocating for the government to actually play an active role in promoting certain things, that always comes with something else. And I'm tired of being told it's not a slippery slope. I'm tired of being told those things are not connected. And that's the part where I start to look at the moment you do this, I'm going to assume you actually mean this, this, and this as well. Why? Because every time else I've seen this always comes with it. And the moment you're trying to implement cultural Marxism, the moment you're trying to implement the erosion of freedom of speech, I think Tim Pool actually did a really good job of saying it at one point. And Tim Pool said, I used to believe that freedom of speech should be a universal principle, something that I would fight for. The old Voltaire quote, right? I may not agree with what you say, sir, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. He goes, you know what I believe now? I will defend your freedom of speech insofar as you defend freedom of speech. The moment you decide not to defend freedom of speech, I will oblige you and no longer defend it for you either. And I think there's actually something to that. I think there's something to look at people and say, if you are willing to utilize these rights for the purpose of oppressing me or denying them to me, well, then I am under no obligation to protect them for you. That's what freedom of association actually means on a practical level. It means I get to associate with the people that agree with me. It means I get to associate with people that disagree with me on things that are not fundamental. And I get to ignore or separate myself from people that I disagree with on the things that are fundamental. But if you refuse to leave me alone, then that ideology, that I will oppose. That I will be willing to use government force to oppose. Why? Because you're the one that instigated the aggressive violence. You might have tried to do it through a political system, but you still imposed aggressive violence, and I'm under no obligation to sit there and let you do it. So I don't want to get rid of the philosophy of classical liberalism. I don't want to get rid of the system that we set in place. I do believe it needs to be restored. We've argued a lot on here. There are some institutions which need to be replaced and some which need to be fought for. I think the system we have needs to be fought for. But to Christian's point, we damn well better wake up to the idea that it is a fight for the very system itself.
The hour is late.
And if we don't learn it right away, we're going to lose. Because the other side is incredibly adamant, incredibly organized, and know exactly what they're fighting for, power. And if we're fighting for freedom, that's a little bit more esoteric. And so what we're going to need to understand, though, is that if we don't have the power, you won't get the freedom. So you got to wake up to that. All right. Well, thank you very much for sticking with us. We know we went a little bit long, but
I loved this.
Also let us know in the comments. Some people have gotten upset with us before when we're kind of like, going back and forth and we're kind of more in the heated debate. Here's what you need to understand about all of us. This is how all of us are. We try to be a little bit more like, not docile, but we try to be a little bit more, you talk, then I talk.
We interrupt each other a lot less on here than we do in real life.
Yes. And we're all like incredibly good friends. We're all like the best of, obviously, Tina and I are married, but
we're best friends.
Christian's one of our best friends. Like, please understand that when you see us, like, what are you talking about? None of that is like hostile toward one another. Yeah. It's one of the ways that we communicate. And I got to say this.
Mom and dad are okay, guys.
Yeah. I got to say this too. I actually really appreciate that we can do that because there are so many environments right now where the moment there's any sort of like passionate dialogue, which sometimes leads to interrupting, although we try to keep it at a minimum, or sometimes leads to, maybe abrupt comments or whatnot. It's almost as if everything divulges and you're not even allowed to have a substantive conversation anymore because it's all about the offense that you brought. So please understand, we're not offended by each other. We like having these conversations. We like testing one another. We like seeing if the other one has really thought about this and can defend their position. And so we push for that. If you like that, please let us know because we'll have some more of what I'm now calling Devil's Advocate podcast, where we do get more into this, not just discussing something, but debating with one another and doing so in a passionate, robust way. Hope you enjoyed it. Please let us know in the comments. Once again, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next episode.